Hey YouTube, this is Jonathan, and I'm back with to start a new video series today. I've decided to go through all of the games, or not all of the games, but all the important games from David Bronstein's book Zurich 1953, which was quite a famous tournament won by Petrosian, I believe. I've been through several of the games in this book before, but I've never really systematically gone through it. And so that's what I'm going to do here on YouTube is go through game by game, and we're just going to take a look at all the interesting ones and present them to you guys here. So the first game of the book is between Szabo and Geller, and this is quite an interesting game for me because Bronstein talks quite a bit about color complex weaknesses in his annotations to this game. So which he comments quite funnily that when he was younger and reading books where the author talked about dark square or light square weaknesses, that he was certain that neither he nor the author understood what a dark square weakness was. Um, he understood that if if an opponent had all of their pawns on light squares and did not have a dark square bishop, that their dark squares would be weak. But he said that, well, all I have to do then is just take all of my pieces off of dark squares, and there'll be nothing there for the opponent to attack. He said it wasn't until much later that he realized that a weakness on one color squares was also a weakness on the other color of squares. So if you're weak on the white squares, you're also weak on the dark squares. And so this first game demonstrates that idea. So it's a Catalan opening between, as I said, Szabo with the white pieces and Geller with the black pieces. Um, we started in the English move order and quickly transposed to Catalan, and White plays this Queen A4 to just get the pawn back almost immediately. And so yeah, Black is threatening now to hold on to the pawn, so he has to take it. And this is an interesting move. This is the first move where Szabo really begins his plan to attack on the dark squares. You can see already that there are several dark squares that have problems on the queen side. And so this queen c6 maneuver is actually aimed at exchanging the dark squared bishops, which is seems rather unconnected, but quickly you'll see how this works. So the rook has to get out of the way, and so the bishop comes out to attack this pawn because it's only defended once. Black's pretty limited in ways of defending this. He can either put the knight on, he can either put the knight on d5, which is what he chooses to do, or he can play rook to b7, which I don't see that happening. Bishop d6 obviously fails to just bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes. So the knight comes out, and now he plays bishop g5, hitting the queen. Well, the knight can't come back because if he plays knight back, then black will, or sorry, white will just capture the knight, and he'll have to take with the pawn because if the queen takes, he'll drop his c pawn. So he has to interpose with the bishop, which he obviously doesn't want to play f6. That would just be too weakening to the king side. So now we have this condition that that we were talking about in the introduction here, where we have all of these dark squares that don't have any pawn protection, and now black no longer has a dark squared bishop. Now the pawn on c7 still does cover a few dark squares, but it's actually a backwards pawn. So black is gonna have to end up exchanging that pawn off in order to keep it from being a liability on its own. Um, but you see, these got these dark squares which have no cover, and so the idea that Bronstein was talking about is that white can now use those dark squares to attack the pawn on a6, and so we're going to see him head in that direction with this game. So we get just completing development. So castles, black pushes back the queen. and then gets rid of that the backwards pawn on the C file before white had a chance to put pressure against it. So we get pawn takes, then the knight takes, rook c1, just doubling on the file. We get rook c8 and knight c3, which is threatening to take off the knight, which I don't know if that's a real threat or not. I don't see why that would be so bad. But this is where Geller makes his first mistake in the game. So he plays knight back to f6, which is removes the knight from the side of the board that it really needs to be on, and also leaves the rook on c8 actually a tad underdefended. So better, according to Bronstein, and I think I'd agree, and it makes sense, was if he had played knight b6. And the idea being that this makes this b4 plan to excuse me, makes the b4 plan to fix these pawns on light squares more difficult to achieve, because black would be threatening to put the knight on c4. Also, it's lending some protection to c8, as I mentioned. So instead, he played knight f6, and then we get b4 almost immediately. However, there actually is a cool tactic that white could have played in this game. He has knight b6, knight takes b5, pawn takes, and then b4. And if the knight moves out of the way, so say ce4, then we get the queen takes rook check, which is, and then after bishop takes, rook takes, and after king d7, we take the other rook, and at the end of all this, white is going to have two rooks for the queen, which should be enough to give him an advantage. But Szabo either didn't see that or decided that he was going to go with his plan from the beginning. So he plays b4, which again is, like I said, going to fix these pawns on the light squares. And knight a4, and so the queen has to move out of the way. Knight takes, rook takes, rook takes, queen takes. He just castles rook c1, which gives him complete control over the c file. It's impossible for black to contest that. If he plays rook c8, then we get another nice combination. Just queen takes rook again, bishop takes, rook takes, and after knight e8, white has the very nice knight e5, which is threatening to play bishop out to c6, and there's really nothing that white can do to prevent that from happening. And once that does happen, he's going to have a rook and two minors for the queen, which should be enough to give him a serious advantage here. So Geller sidesteps that, puts his own rook on d8, and then white plays a3, and which frees up his queen now. He really wants to play queen to c7. But something that I was wondering about when I was looking over this game myself is, okay, so black has his pawns on these two light squares, which gives him problems on the dark squares. Well, doesn't white have his problems on the two dark squares here, and why doesn't he have any problems with the light squares? I mean, I guess you could say it's because the light square bishops are still on the board, but white's light squared bishop doesn't have any influence over these squares here, and is going to be a little bit more difficult for him to get them over there. And so I pondered on this, and I think that the answer must be because white has an initiative here. So white's the one who's creating threats, and black has to respond to those threats. And so that means that black really has no time to take advantage of those light square problems, like black has on his side. So I think that must be the answer. At least it's the best I can come up with. Anyhow, black plays knight d5, which prevents white from playing queen into c7, and it also prevents white's other plan, which would have been to have played either knight d1 or knight e5, knight e3, and then knight into c5. So white would really like to get a knight on c5 because it would begin hitting the a6 pawn and could cause some. It coordinates nicely with the bishop against the b7 square as well. So knight d5 was a nice move. And so since the c7 square is taken away, white plays queen d4, and he has an idea of invading against these dark squares here. Specifically, a7 would be a good square. After f6, which just gains space, is going to take away the d4 square and the e5 square away from white's knight. um, Excuse me, I'm sorry about that. So, and then white begins the process of putting the knight on c5. He's just going to go d3, c5, and we get e5 here. And so we get a move that Bronstein says is consistent, but he says it's a bit of a lifeless move. So we get queen c5, um, which I agree is consistent because he's continuing to use the dark squares. He's going to get another piece into c5 he could. But better, according to Bronstein, would have been to play queen a7 when black actually has a few problems. It's unclear how he's gonna dislodge that queen. If he tries the obvious rook a8, he ends up in a horrible situation after bishop d5. He's just going to drop the bishop on c7, and he's going to be two pieces down. So that's obviously not a possibility. If he plays queen f8 to try to avoid that, then we get knight d3, and now if rook a8, queen to c5, which is better this time because now if black changes queens, then white can recapture with the knight. So this would be a better situation of the queen landing on c5 because we've exchanged this knight. Sorry, the king f8 with knight d3, which is favorable for white. So if instead we get rook d7, which again threatens to expose the queen, we get another nice tactic. Queen takes b7 exclam. Rook takes, and then we get this bishop d5 check again, and rook c8 is going to follow. So if we get something like this, we can't help but think that white is probably going to be able to pull a victory out of this one. I would imagine so. So instead, Bronstein says that probably the best thing that black could do here would be against queen a7 be to play e4. So if we get e4, then just simply bishop takes, queen takes bishop, queen takes bishop, and queen takes e2, which he says is unclear. And we can see here that knight e3 is definitely a threat that black has to or white has to respond to. But queen a3, let's say if we play something like this. This seems like a threat. No, actually, never mind. We get, it's cleverly, I didn't see this before, but yeah, we get this nice queen check. But anyway, let's say that he gets greedy and decides to take, let's make a non-move to show what the threat was. But, I mean, he can't take it. There we go. He can't take it because of this. But yeah, never mind. I missed and there's a nice shot that that white has there with the check. There's a lot of problems on this diagonal. We had a lot of bishop takes d5 checks, and maybe this f6 e5 idea did cause some exposure. But even so, after e4, bishop takes, and down this line, this is pretty unclear, and perhaps this is what Szabo wanted to avoid. Instead, after he just played, instead of the queen a7 line, we get the queen c5, and we get trades, and pawn takes c5, which is another move that Bronstein criticizes. He says that what Szabo was hoping for is that his pen on d5 and the threat of playing c6 would be enough to usher him home to victory. But in reality, black is going to be able to repel that plan, and then the c pawn ends up being a liability. So at this point, it seems that his attack on the dark squares has not succeeded, and he's sort of lost his way, and eventually this is going to cost him the game. So bishop c6, rook d1, uh, rook d7, and we get bishop h3, rook e7, knight c2, a5, and bishop g2, rook d7, bishop h3, rook e7. So we have a chance here for repetition, but white decides that he still believes he must be better. He apparently has not gotten over that he has lost his advantage, and so goes king f1 to try to continue to play for a win. King f7 and king e1. So he still had the opportunity. Could have gone back to g2 to repeat the position again, but after king e1, he's committed to continuing to play on. But this move actually just costs him the pawn. So after rook c7, we get rook d3, bishop to c8, b7, and there's just no way for him to hold the c pawn here. Excuse me. So knight e3, rook takes, knight f5, threatening a fork here on d6. So avoids that. Check. King f8. The bishop comes back. So g6, he's just preparing king e7 here. We get king d2, king e7 coming in. Knight e4, rook c4. He's starting to invade the position. f3, f5. And we can see that black's forces are starting to overwhelm, and white seems to be getting pushed back. This bishop is kind of sorry now, and the knight's pretty terrible. His rook's still okay, though. Knight d1, trying to get out, e4, and now the rook is shoved aside. Rook d4, and b4. So black's just going to make a pass pawn and queen that, and black's really pretty helpless to prevent that. It's interesting over the next few moves to watch how the white pieces get shoved back over to the king side, and the pawn gets advanced. So knight e3, knight c3, nice square. Threaten to pick up the pawn here on e2. This is probably one of my favorite parts of the game here. We have this Geller delays the recapture of this pawn for several moves. It's really interesting. So we get a check, just winning a pawn. So king b1, bishop a4, which is nice. I think that's a really nice move because it seems if he takes immediately, there could be an issue with the knight c2. Black has his ways out of that, but even just avoiding that little inkling of counterplay there. You get bishop a4, plus it helps clear the road for the b pawn, what will be a b pawn, eventually queening. Knight c3 check, again, just shoving the king out of the way. And finally he has to take the pawn. Rook d2, hoping to I don't know what he's hoping for. He's down 2 pawns. There's really not much to hope for at all, actually. So just trading the rooks, the king. He starts to bring the king up, knight g4, and the king gets up in to help support the pawn, and there's really just nothing he's going to be able to do. So now his pieces are back completely on the king side. He's down 3 pawns now. We get a check, and the knight coordinates very nicely with the bishop to keep the king out. Obviously, the king can't go back to d1 or he'll lose the knight, so has to get shoved even further over. And then after b3, Szabo decides to throw in the towel. So, and resigns here. So, a very interesting game, and I think quite a nice explanation of the dark square weakness on the queen side. It's unfortunate that Szabo wasn't able to convert that and lost his way. It would have been really nice to explain a dark square weakness and one that pays off, but nonetheless very instructive. So that's it for this one. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time. with another game from Zurich 1953. Subscribe, and we'll keep them coming. All right, thanks, guys. Bye-bye.